All right, Moto Heroes. So first thing we're gonna wanna do before we hop on that bike is we're gonna wanna perform that pre-ride inspection. We're gonna start with the tires. I'm gonna give you a super quick story of something that happened to me one day when I didn't do a pre-ride inspection. I just hopped on the bike, didn't check the tire pressure level, didn't check anything, went on a ride into the canyons and the twisties where I had no cell phone reception. On my way back, probably about a quarter of the way into the ride on the way back, my tire actually blew out. And the reason why was my pressures were too low. And so the rim actually pinched the inner tube that was inside of that tire and it caused me to go flat. Next thing I know, there's coyotes around me out in the distance. I'm having to hike my motorcycle up the twisties for about 30 to 40 minutes just to get cell phone reception, just to call my roadside assistance. And what could have been a really good and fun ride actually turned into a miserable day, having to eat crap food while I waited 2 hours for roadside assistance. Totally sucked. Could have been avoided by a simple pre-ride inspection. So let's talk about the tires. First thing we're gonna wanna do with these tires is we're gonna wanna check the recommended PSI level. I wanna give you a note about the PSI level. The PSI level can actually be found on your motorcycle or it can be found inside of your manual. That is a good recommended PSI level to start with. However, if your motorcycle has adjustable suspension or if you've tuned the suspension to your riding settings and your riding style, you're gonna have different PSI levels than what's recommended to you from the factory. So when you run that pre-ride inspection, just run those PSI levels either to the factory or to the specific levels that's been set aside for your custom tune settings on your suspension. The second thing we're gonna wanna do with those tires is we're gonna wanna check that tread depth. The tread depth is actually gonna have what we call wear bars. If you see that your tread is actually running past those wear bars, it's definitely time to get that tire removed. You know, if your tire is looking more bald than Joe Rogan, it's definitely time to get that tire removed and changed out. The other thing we're gonna wanna do is we're gonna wanna check those sidewalls for cracks. We're also gonna wanna check not only the sidewalls for cracks, but we're gonna wanna check our actual tire to make sure that it is not punctured in any kind of way, like two people fighting in a knife fight. You don't want that. The other thing we're gonna wanna check is gonna be the lights. Now keep in mind, some of your lights will not even come on all the way unless the bike is on. So let's get that bike properly turned on to check those lights. Turn the bike on, verify that it's in neutral, squeeze that clutch in, hit that ignition key, grab that front brake just to be safe, slowly release that clutch, verify that that bike is in neutral. Come around to the front, I can verify that my main light is on. I hit that pass button just to make sure that the high beams are working. The other thing I can see is that both signal lights are on. Now I want to verify that they actually flash. I can see over here the left signal lights are flashing. I can see over here that the right signal lights are flashing. One other thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to come around, just double check that my rear light is on. It is. Go ahead and slide my sexy foot over, tap that, and I can see that that brake light is working. All lights are working and functioning as they are supposed to. First thing, as far as the throttle is concerned, I just want to rotate that a little bit and let it go. I want to make sure that snaps back. That thing is spring loaded. The last thing you want on the road is to hold that throttle and release it and it doesn't go back. Then the bike is speeding up when you don't want it to. You don't want that. Moving on to both of my levers, as far as my brake lever is concerned, I want to make sure that there's no free play in it. I want to make sure that that brake lever is actually operational. I shouldn't be able to move my motorcycle when I'm squeezing that. As far as the clutch lever is concerned, I want to make sure there's no free play. I want to make sure it feels good. I want to make sure it's been adjusted for me. And for both the brake and the clutch lever, I'm actually looking at the cables and the lines and just verifying that there are actually no cracks or tears or anything that can cause my motorcycle not to function properly while I am on this sexy beast right here. Now, moving to the foot controls, we want to do the same thing. We just want to make sure that those foot controls are actually working. When we did our light check, I actually pressed the brake, so we saw that that light came on. One thing I can do, if I wanted to, is I could just mount this motorcycle really quick. I could get on it, go ahead and give that breaker squeeze, try to move that bike, rock that bike, see that that bike is not rocking. That foot control is working as it should. If I wanted to, I could turn on the motorcycle. I could see that I'm in neutral, give that one click down and just verify that these foot controls are working. The reason the motorcycle turned off is because when it went into first with the kickstand being down, that safety mechanism engaged and turned the motorcycle off. My dash is actually still on. My tachymeter is still on. I can actually just give that a half a click and go back into neutral and verify that these foot controls are working as appropriately. One other thing we're looking for during that pre-ride inspection is that fuel gauge. I'm just verifying that my fuel gauge actually has enough fuel for the actual ride that I am going to take. One other thing you're going to want to do regarding fuel is you're going to want to check those fuel levels. Make sure that there's actually no fuel leaks coming underneath the bike. You can also check the fuel lines and just make sure there's no cracks or no leaks. When we're thinking about the engine during our pre-ride inspection, we're going to want to make sure the oil level is where it needs to be. There's usually a little window that you can check. Take a look at your manual to determine the best way to check the recommended oil pressure levels for your motorcycle. Also, want to make sure there's no weird noises that are coming from the engine. And you can always look underneath the bike just to make sure there's no oil leaks or anything like that. Let's talk about motorcycle suspension. One of the most overlooked aspects of motorcycle suspension is getting it properly tuned. So we're going to get into how do you take a look at it, but I think the first thing you need to do when we're talking about motorcycle suspension is go ahead and get that motorcycle suspension tuned for your body weight, number one, and number two, for the type of riding that you're going to be doing. When I come down here and take a look at motorcycle suspension, what I'm looking for is I want to make sure there's really no cracks inside of these seals. I want to look in the front to make sure there's no cracks in the seals. I want to look in the rear to make sure there's no cracks in the seals. If there are cracks in the seals and I can't see them, another way that I can tell is if I look at the metal aspect of my suspension and I see the grooves being worn into it. That tells me that some type of debris has gotten in here and it's actually scratching and killing my motorcycle suspension. Okay, Moto Heroes, let's talk about lubricants. When it comes to this motorcycle, we want to make sure she's a well-oiled machine. So in addition to checking those oil levels, we're going to want to make sure we have the appropriate amount of brake fluid. We're also going to want to make sure that that brake fluid is not dirty, and we want to ensure that there's no leaks. Just feel around, make sure there's no leaks coming outside of that brake fluid. And the other thing we want to make sure that we have is coolant. We don't want the bike to overheat, so we tilt the bike up. Your bike will have a coolant reservoir located at a specific spot. I know mine is right here. I can actually look in here and see that the coolant is where it needs to be. So take a look at your manual, make sure you have the appropriate coolant level. We got to make sure the bike is ready to actually move. We do that by checking the drivetrain. What you want to do is just go ahead and make sure that your motorcycle chain has the appropriate tension. The way you do that is you can use a tensioner tool and just check the actual measurements based off of what the tension recommendations are for your specific motorcycle. One of the overlooked things on a motorcycle pre-ride inspection are the fasteners. I got a story for you. That was a time where I didn't check my fasteners and I was riding. I was in the middle of a four-way intersection taking a left-hand turn. I was in first gear getting ready to shift into second. When I went to shift, I had no shift lever. I looked down, my shift lever is actually hanging and dangling. This was all because there was a fastener that was loose, and that vibration actually shook that fastener off. Needless to say, I did not find that fastener. I had to walk and knock on someone's door, and I kid you not, this is a true story. Luckily, they